I'm going to hit record and we'll begin. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming to CapitalCamp. Thank you for coming to my presentation. I'm going to talk about Drupal's destiny. And just first to frame this this kind of bold title for a discussion, just so you get a sense of where I come from. I got started in Drupal, appropriately enough in DC, because I wanted to take over the government. That's kind of the scale that I was operating at. In particular, I actually wanted this war not to happen, and I was doing a bunch of like anti-war organizing, and I'm like from hippies, so that's kind of like not a stretch for me to like stand in the street and hold up a sign. But I realized actually even while we were doing all this that it probably wasn't going to work. Right? It felt good to get together with a bunch of people and do something, but I kind of had this sneaking suspicion that it was not going to be effective, and sure enough, it wasn't. And I started thinking, well, I should take that energy and apply it more directly. And I should get involved in influencing the outcome of elections, because if the people in charge aren't listening, maybe we can change who the people in charge are, and it'll be a better scene because they'll actually listen to us or they'll make smarter decisions on their own. So I found this guy through the blogosphere. I was like on the internet in like 2003 and blogging and doing stuff, and people were recommending this gentleman as someone worth supporting, and I watched some videos and I got excited, and I started thinking, hey, this is really a chance for me to use my, not only do I agree with what he's saying, but I also feel like I have a chance to matter here because I can use my sort of high value skills, my internet skills, my open source skills, etc., and not just like sign petitions or so forth and do something that seems very, marginal in terms of effect. And so I went out and I, sent my resume to the campaign, which is all of like 7 people at the time, and they never got back to me. And I Googled and tried to figure out what could go on, and I found this website called Hack for Dean. And it was said, Internet professionals of the world unite. We cannot wait for this campaign. They won't tell us what to do. We just have to do it for them. And I thought that was a good message. That sounded like kind of where I was coming from. And so I joined up with this thing, and we had a mailing list, and we sort of like thrashed around on what we were actually going to do, and we changed our name to something less threatening than Hack for Dean. And we decided what we needed was a campaign in a box. Because there were all these affinity groups growing up around this campaign. There was like Teachers for Dean, and Pilots for Dean, and Lawyers for Dean, and Minnesota for Dean, and Tulsa for Dean, and so on and so forth. And we needed a way for them all to have a great web presence without having to do a bunch of work. And we realized that we should probably pick up something that was existent in the open source community, because building it from scratch made no sense. And more by luck than anything else, we found Drupal at a very early stage. This Hack for Dean happened way back when, before Drupal was really a thing. It was like Drupal 4.2, there was like a small community around it. There were a few thousand people using this technology. And we basically hacked it up a little bit. We hacked the core, and we provided some files to go along with it, and our own modules to essentially have what would be a very early version of what's now called an installation profile. And it was actually very successful. It powered hundreds of affinity groups. It was used by the campaign itself. A couple people I worked with got hired. They moved to Burlington, powered the state-level campaign apparatus and their websites. And it was a very heady time, right? We were actually making a difference. This guy was supposed to be nobody from Vermont, and he was, threatening to win the primary and, showing that you could actually do a lot of this stuff that we believed in theoretically that made the internet made possible. The idea that peer-to-peer organization could beat top-down organization, and that networks could defeat hierarchies, and that you could actually take a lot of these theoretical ideas that, people like David Weinberger and other people, small pieces loosely joined, and all this other stuff that was like, okay, here's the theory of how the internet works, here's the theory of how open source works, and apply it directly to making something happen in the real world. And that was a very, very intoxicating time and a very powerful time to be a part of something that was a pretty big deal for a little while. But it didn't work out, obviously, as politicos will know. The campaign failed in rather spectacular fashion. We got beaten pretty badly in the end. But we kept going. Because we were onto something. We felt like we had found something that was actually good and was working. We turned this into a nonprofit. That's me and a young Neil Drum and a young Zach Rosen. And basically we found a benefactor in Silicon Valley who said, okay, well, your Dean campaign thing, that was cool, but what if you did that for everybody? Just like no campaign, no partisanship, no just like make organization easier for nonprofits and civic-based things. We basically turned what was Dean Space originally, our campaign software, into civic space. And that was also very successful, actually, just packaging that up and like making it intelligible to nonprofit organizations, evangelizing it, selling it, having a marketing website that explained it, and saying, here's a solution to your problems. For a while, Civic Space was getting more downloads than Drupal was itself, because it was sort of delivered as a solution rather than as a generic toolkit. But Civic Space, unfortunately, never found a sustainable revenue model, and so while we got like thousands of nonprofits sort of initially hooked on Drupal and kind of seeded that early professional ecosystem, and like a lot of the early paying gigs in Drupal came from organizations saying, oh, I like this open source thing, I like Civic Space, wait, I have Drupal? I need to hire somebody for that? Okay, cool, right? That was how a lot of stuff got started. It wasn't sustainable because they never gave any money back to Civic Space, and we never figured that out, and so on and so forth. We decided, we looked around and we saw people were doing this stuff professionally now, and that seemed like a good idea too, because like we could work for ourselves rather than working for someone else. And we were all for Drupal. Like we were doing all kinds of crazy stuff, wearing bike jerseys and so forth. We met up with this guy who was a co-founder with me and Zach, a consultancy called Chapter 3. You're Drupal experts in San Francisco, still going strong. And we decided to do it legitimately and formed a business and made that happen and sort of grew it up. And then we met up with this guy who's like the best engineer that I know, and he made Drupal sort of scalable and so forth, and we convinced him to leave Texas and move to San Francisco and start an even bigger company that I'm doing now. That's the shirt I'm wearing, called Pantheon. And that's where I am now. Like we're doing a big Drupal platform that just powers the internet and so on and so forth. And so that's my journey coming into this space, just for reference. So here's the point. I like being an entrepreneur. I like starting things. It's a lot of fun. It's cool to be in the master of your own destiny and so forth. And I like winning. Having had the experience of losing rather badly in a number of different situations, it's a lot better to win than it is to lose. It's a lot more enjoyable, I'll tell you right now, to be a winner than to be a loser. But more than that, I really like being a part of something that's bigger than myself. And I think that people in this community sometimes feel that way about Drupal. People in this space sometimes feel that way about the internet at large. You feel like you're part of something that's larger than yourself. And that's a very important and powerful and meaningful thing that's not to be dismissed. There's this theory of like what drives human beings. This is Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. He's a psychologist from the 1950s. And he basically says you have this pyramid that you ascend. You start with your physiological needs, because if you can't breathe and you have no water and you have no food, then kind of nothing else matters. And then you need to be safe, because if you're being bullied or chased by a lion or abused in your home, kind of nothing else matters, like you're in survival mode. And assuming that you have food, water, air, safety, which thankfully most of us in a civilization have, though not everyone around the world, unfortunately, you start to think about your social needs, like you want to have friends, you want to have a family, and if you have a friends and family, you want to have them like you want to have esteem, you want them to say, good job, I respect what you do matters, you get a gold star, etc. And if you're doing all those things really well, then you kind of get to this existential question of self-actualization, which is like, what is the meaning of life? And people tend to find, in the theory, self-actualization is where you sort of turn to this being part of something bigger than yourself. You engage in creative pursuits, you engage in the pursuit of new knowledge, research, development, science, you engage in spiritual discovery, all these other things that kind of make you a wider person. It's all kind of ties back to giving back to the world and being a part of the big family of humanity and all that hippy-dippy stuff. But it's very real. And I find self-actualization through my work in Drupal and on the internet, because I truly believe that the internet is a force for global good in a way that the US Navy can only give lip service to. I think, and that's, so show of hands, who thinks on balance the internet is good for the world? So most people, right? But that's not an uncontroversial statement, right? There are a lot of people out there who think that the internet is bad or dangerous, that it's, that it's a way to corrupt the youth, or if you're a repressive regime, it's a way to get access to unauthorized history or news that you're not supposed to see, right? And you kind of have to like think about the types of people in the world that are afraid of the internet because they're out there. And there's also the fact that what am I doing next? Oh yeah. But I think it is actually a force for global good. I think it benefits humanity, and I kind of like that it can corrupt the youth, and I like that the internet threatens regimes that are based on disinformation and control of an alternative history. I think that the internet actually creates communication between people. It helps people share knowledge, and every time we've seen that happen in the course of human history, there's been a renaissance. There's a renaissance effect that follows on after people are able to open themselves up to what's possible and share with each other. That's just how it works. Like when you see ecclesiastical orders break down and suddenly everybody can read books in ways that they couldn't before, or you see people able to print things, or you see, social orders get together that are about the sharing of knowledge, those are always the precursors for the things that we call progress, right? The invention of new technologies, the spreading of liberties, the growth of equality, the growth of the improvement of standards of living. All these things follow on people being able to communicate better, basically, is how it works out. And I think that the internet can do this for us right now. I don't think it has actually done it for us yet. I think it's only just beginning to do, because this type of revolutionary Renaissance effect only begins when the technology that we're all involved in and I'm super obsessed with fades into the background, and that's no longer the story. The story isn't, oh my god, the internet. The story is people connecting. But that's not to say that there aren't like downsides to the internet, and I think it's important to take the skeptical view seriously. So it used to be that in order for a photograph, like a powerful photograph, to make its way around the world, you had to have like an intrepid photojournalist who is a highly professional person go into a very special place, get just the right shot, probably shot like 50 shots of this photo, right? And then like they sent them all to their editor. The editor looked at all of them and was like, that's the one. Like picked the best one, and they like cropped it and framed it and like probably corrected some color and stuff, and then they printed it on the cover of the newspaper, and then it was seen around the world. And so one of the things the internet does by enabling all this communication is make it really easy to share stupid things, like my botched photo attempt of my engagement in Disneyland. And so, it's easy to cherry pick things that are kind of like face palms for humanity, and say like, oh, the internet makes us stupid. Oh, the internet's just used for crap, right? And it's because there's so much more volume of communication, it's really easy to find lots of mediocre communication. But fail just happens. That's just part of life. That's part of being a person, and it happens with or without the internet. The internet doesn't make us dumber. The internet makes our dumbness more apparent. It makes it easier to see how people kind of screw up and drop the ball sometimes. I also think it's worthwhile to take this guy's critique seriously. This is Elon Musk, who's a colorful personality, but I like him as an entrepreneur because he made a ton of money on PayPal and then threw it all down on solar power, electric cars, and rockets. And that's like a cool portfolio, right? That's like, I've got a vision for the future where we all drive electric cars on Mars, and let's do it. And he was at this conference recently in New York and kind of was chiding people in Silicon Valley for focusing on these software ideas and building apps, and that was like what entrepreneurs were doing. It's like, that's baby games. Like, what are you going to do with that? Like, what's your phone app really going to do for the world? I'm going to Mars. And I think it's a worthwhile critique, because a lot of times people end up with like getting obsessed with software and getting obsessed with technology. And there's this notion. There's also this article that was recently in the New Yorker, George Packer, and talking about the way that people who develop technology are kind of obsessed with their own problems, and so oftentimes you see these things emerging, and it's like well-educated upper middle class heterosexual white males solving the problems of well-educated upper middle class heterosexual white males, and it kind of is a little bit not what it should be, or even just thinking that there's a solution to all your problems in technology. And so my vision for this renaissance, and my vision for the internet, and my vision for Drupal, which I'm going to get to in just a second, is, I think, takes in this critique into account, because I don't believe that any technology is the solution. There is no app that's going to solve our problems. There's no like software that's going to save the world. The solution is us. It's people. And the technology that I believe in is just what brings our potential to the fore. And that's really the sort of the meta message here, because I believe that we are making the printing press, right? That's what we're doing. We're building the equivalent of the printing press for the next Renaissance. And that's a very fundamental, basic base building technology. It's not the answer to anything. And in fact, the printing press and the internet are used for terrible things, because like haters are going to hate, predators are going to be predators, scammers are going to scam, and they're all going to use these technologies to do awful, horrible things that we find reprehensible and disagree with. But that's part of the bigger picture of allowing humanity to rise up a little bit and connect with each other. And so in the same way that I feel this technology drove a renaissance, 400 or 500 years ago and helped the United States become independent, if you believe that, I think the internet is going to do that for all of us, right? And so the real question is, what is the printing press of the 21st century? It's not just the internet. It's the destinations on the internet. It's the places you go. Like, there's all these cool websites out there. There's like Google and Facebook and Pinterest and Reddit and so on and so forth, and they get a lot of press. But they're all, in a lot of ways, pointing people to other places. There's destinations. Destinations make the web work. Destinations make the internet work. Destinations are where people publish their ideas, where they interact with each other, where they coordinate, where they have their campaigns. And it's not just Drupal, but the there. It's really like websites, right? And I think websites get kind of short shrift in a lot of times in the technology community because it's like not very exciting, or it's kind of like hacky or whatever. It's like web trash. But I feel like that's really that's where the magic happens, and in these destinations where people go on the internet. And so Drupal has this unique capability, which is kind of because it's a mashup machine. It's designed to like take data from APIs and then like spit it out, not just as like a web page, but maybe also to a mobile app, and maybe also to like JSON or something else. And it's been doing this since the very beginning. This is like a demo. It's a video of a demo that my business partner did way back in Drupal 4.7, and it was like, we can take like data from San Francisco city government and use Google Maps and put it together, and here's a crime map. Right now, that's like somebody else has like made. There's like 5 different things that do that, but it was so easy to do for yourself with Drupal because it has this two-way capability, both to the user, to and from the user, and to and from the web, and that's very powerful. That's what makes it a printing press for the 21st century. It's not just static publishing. It's not just, okay, here's a copy of my thing. Now that's very powerful. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to bag on WordPress, and I'm not bagging on Twitter or anything else like that, because the ability just to get your voice out there is fundamentally important. But the ability to do something more than that, to have a conversation both with people and with the machines, is something that is what rises to the level of printing press, in my opinion. That's what makes that's what's going to really change the world, and we have this big machine that'll do that. And so now we get to what is actually going on. Like, let's kind of go out, like take a step down out of theoretical level into normal level, and look at the CMS market. This is the CMS market today. These are stats that are publicly available. You can do your own run of the numbers at W3 Techs, and they have a spider that's going out there and like crawling the internet and finding out what people are running. And this is this graph shows to the 0.1%. So Tumblr is all the way back here at 0.1% of the internet. Still, I'm not saying that to say Tumblr's no big deal, because obviously they are. That's a lot of internet, right? And WordPress is all the way over there at almost 20%. It's just over 18%. 18% of the internet is WordPress, which is kind of awesome when you think about it. That's a pretty impressive chunk. And according to their stats, Joomla's second by volume, Drupal's third, and they're growing. And so what can we learn if we look at these things and kind of look at the names that are in there? There's a few things we can learn. One is that open source is winning, and in particular LAMP is winning. All of the top 20 leading technologies, most of them are open source. Most of them are Linux, PHP in particular, and MySQL. That's maybe Apache too. Like that stack that sort of became a thing in the early aughts is totally eating everyone else's lunch. There's only one, like SharePoint is in there, and it's all the way back here. .NET Nuke is right there, but that's it in terms of stuff that's on alternative platforms. The rest of it is all open source. Typo 3, I think, is a PHP, or Typo 3 is Python, but like Blogger is a hosted service, and Tumblr is a hosted service. But like, really, this stuff is winning, and it's going to continue winning for a lot of important reasons that I'll explain. Another takeaway, if you look at the top right here, we can just see it's still a power law within this space. This guy's kind of winning. This is Matt Mullenweg. He's the founder of WordPress, and like he's letting his hair flow and feeling it because he's doing pretty good. He's done a great thing and made a pretty awesome technology and built a really good business for himself. But don't jump to any conclusions about Matt. I mean, he's doing fine. He's not going to be in any trouble. But all of the graphs that I was just showing you are kind of a lie because I was omitting the true market leader. Does anybody have a guess at what the true market leader is in the CMS space? Well, I'll show you. The true market leader is None. None is kicking everyone's ass. With almost 70% of the internet, it runs on None. And that means, like, by volume of sites, there's no detectable software behind 70% of the internet. And that's like legacy. That's some of like everything that got built in like 2000, before like 2004, 2005 probably ran on None. It was like some HTML files you FTP'd up. It was some stuff that you hacked together on your own. Like who in here who's a developer got into Drupal after writing your own CMS, right? That was how I got started. So I was part of None back in the day. And None doesn't mean nothing. It just means nothing that was detectable. There was no identifiable signature, no aggregate value. And that's proprietary solutions that have a very niche audience. and again, like custom jobs and flat HTML. And if you look at none in the context of the wider market, it still resembles a perfect power law. But the thing is, I've been tracking this stat for a while. None is losing market share, steadily and increasingly. Nobody goes with none anymore, right? When you rebuild your site, you don't build it on none, you don't write your own, you don't just go back to like uploading some HTML to the internet. Like you go with one of these other technologies, or maybe one that's even further down the curve. Like there's 60 more out here that go down to like 0.05%.
Google Sites.
Exactly. Google Sites is in there somewhere and other things like that. But nobody goes with none now because you want to have this printing press effect. Like you don't want to just, you're not like carving your message into like a piece of paper or hand copying it and posting it in the town square. You want a machine behind your message. You want software. It's assumed now that when you go to a website, there's software behind it. It's not just documents that are sitting on a server somewhere. And so none is going to lose eventually. And this is actually kind of a classic scenario you can see in the technology space in general. The same, like not none, but like whatever, has been a leader in the operating system space back in the day. It's been a leader in the database space. For a while, this was like how phones looked, where you had no clear consensus around what actually worked. There's a lot of people doing it however they could, and just making it happen was sort of the name of the game. But eventually, this market will mature, I believe, just like all the other markets have matured, and will coalesce around a few winners in this space. And for context, I think winning means running like a third of the internet. 30% of the internet would be winning. Maybe 20%, somebody's probably going to have 50%. We'll see. But that's probably going to happen in terms of websites. Like the technology, we will gather together around the common technologies that actually solve our problems, and those winning technologies will run 20, 30, 40% of the web. That's going to happen, I believe. And that's a lot. Let's just be clear. That's a whole lot of internet. This is a graph of like the total size of the internet, total number of websites. And so logarithmically, we're up around, this is like 200 million. So like 60 million websites is a lot of websites. And that's more than WordPress runs now. That's certainly more than Drupal does. But I think Drupal has this capability to run that many websites, to be that big of a story on the internet. And more than I think it has this capability, I think it's important. I think it's important that Drupal does this. And that's, I think, not just because I have this tribal affiliation with Drupal, having done it for a long time. I think it's because Drupal is uniquely suited to have this renaissance effect. Because it's not just personal publishing. It's not just, getting your message out there. It's the ability to create things that are dynamic and that actually interact with the rest of the world. Like Drupal is the way that you can build something where, magical stuff happens. Like I filled in a form on the internet and a second later my phone rings. Right? That's the type of stuff that really, you can sense the possibility around interactions like that. And you can sense the possibility around user experiences like that. And I'll go out on a limb and say it, that like no cookie cutter, like just fill in the blanks here, technology for putting up websites will ever be dominant and will ever drive this kind of renaissance. Like it's a very good thing for people and businesses who don't have a lot of money and don't have a lot of time to be able to put their presence on the web and say like, hey, I have a website, I'm a real deal, you can read about me here. That's really good and that's very important. But that's not going to like make this next level stuff happen. And moreover, that's not going to be an acceptable limitation for organizations, businesses, and ambitious individuals, because if you're really trying to do something, you're going to be using the internet, you're going to need your own design, you're going to need your own user experience, you're going to need to control the business logic, and you're going to need to own the data. You can't leave your data in someone else's system if you're serious about, like the nonprofit world where we came from, right? There are still these, where I came from, there are still these like giant hulking companies that defend themselves because they own all the donor data. They have like all these nonprofit organizations by the balls, basically, because they're like, we own your money. If you want to raise money, you have to use our software. And that puts them in this very disadvantageous position because they're stuck with whatever those guys want to build and whatever they want to innovate, not what I want to do with my campaign. And so that was like one of the first like real breakout things, again, very early in my experience with Drupal, was we don't have to do it that way. We can build our own thing. We can own our own data. We can have our own message. We can be free from all these other constraints. We don't have to wait on someone else to invent this technology. We can do it ourselves. And that's what can drive this renaissance effect. And Drupal has this unique capability to do that. So what will it take for these dominant technologies to emerge? I think the first thing it's going to take, as I was just explaining, is flexibility, because you're going to need the ability to like have a design that's exactly what you want. You're going to need the ability to integrate with systems. common systems, and also like weird, crazy back-end systems that drive factories, right? And then those are like all custom. Like you have to be able to like handle your own code if you want to be able to do what you need to do on the web. It's also very important as the use cases evolve and the devices evolve. So there are some good technologies now for like doing mobilizing stuff, but it's all kind of, maybe that's it, maybe that's not it. And that's a fast-moving field, and you need a flexible technology to keep up with the rest of the internet. Anytime you buy into someone else's software, like a proprietary system, you're buying into their engineering team, basically. And no small, singular engineering team for software will ever keep up with a big distributed open source project. That's why open source is winning this space already. That's why open source is going to continue to win in this space. You need the ability to do all this stuff on mobile with different devices, because the future of the internet is not on laptops. I mean, it'll always be here, but it's increasingly on like things like this, and in the future, who knows, things like this, and maybe eventually like all walls are just like, hey, I wonder what's on the internet these days. Stuff like that's going to happen, right? And the ability to be working on different devices and flexible and stuff like that, that's a huge thing with Drupal 8, is that this idea is baked into the core of it. Very important. You're going to need a lot of people. It's not just about the technology and not just about the software. No technology or software has ever become widely adopted without millions of people behind it who can service, support, implement, train, all these things. Like the technology alone doesn't ever do it. You have to have like a network and an ecosystem of people that are driving and supporting a technology for it to become dominant, for it to emerge. And it also has to be kind of like fast and smooth. Like you got to be able to get in, turn the key, start the car, drive, and just take off, right? That's key to that kind of on-ramp and so forth. If for something to really get up to like running a third of the internet, it's got to be pretty easy to get started. So how does Drupal look? Well, you guys know the story. This probably isn't all that news to you. But from a flexibility standpoint, we're sort of got it going on, right? Because Drupal does all these different use cases, and it does them all with style and grace. And that's important because it means that we're not just about personal publishing. Like WordPress is doing great, but it's really slotted into this personal publishing use case where it's killing it. That anything else, you're kind of like, kind of building your deck out over a cliff, and maybe it's going to work and maybe it's not. Drupal does all these different things solidly, stably, extensively, supportably. And it's because we have this kind of modular architecture. People put Legos in their slides all the time, but it's a pretty good analogy for how we build stuff with this system. And that's very unique. That is a unique aspect of, if I jumped back to all those technologies you could run down the line. We're the only ones that really have this in the web space. And that's pretty important, because it means that we can serve a wide range of use cases, we can cut across different use cases, we can mix, we can match, we can mash up, and that's very awesome. Labor force, right? Do we have all those people? Well, yes, we do. First of all, we're built on PHP, which is not the sexiest technology, doesn't get a lot of hipster love, but there are 5 million people in the world that develop PHP. You can't say that about Ruby on Rails, you can't say that about Python, you certainly can't say that about C# or whatever. PHP has one of the largest pools of accredited people who can work on it compared to other languages. And it's because it is the first purpose-built language for the web. PHP is the PHP hypertext preprocessor. Right? It was made for building websites. And the web is a huge use case. It's a huge market. And people all around the world know how to use this. So in actuality, whenever you hear somebody saying like, oh yeah, it's built in PHP, oh, whatever, you'd be like, well, it does its job really well, and people all around the world know how to use this. And that's important. That matters. Drupal itself has like maybe 100,000, depending on how you count, I guess around 100,000 real active developers, and that's like 2% of the PHP workforce. So we've got room to grow, which is good, and also 100,000 is a lot. Like we have a pretty good community behind us, and that's important, right? The fact that Drupal has such a large pool of users and developers is important for its chances to become a dominant technology on the internet. We're also growing that. Day by day, we've published all these books, we do all these trainings, we're doing these camps. It's a very active community that is really seeking to empower, involve, and embrace more people. And there's also this huge professional services ecosystem around all this stuff, which is incredibly important because it's not just about like people and developers out there, it's also about businesses. You got to be able to hire someone. You need to have like real industry behind the technology for it to run a third of the internet. And then we come to on-ramp. Spoiler alert, this is where we have work to do. It's not quite as easy as it should be. It's sort of a little bit of a bridge to nowhere. There's this famous graph of CMS learning curves, and Drupal people are killing themselves, and there's bulldozers and bodies and all these other things. And this is not news. This doesn't surprise anyone. We've known this for a long time. This is a slide that I saw was in a presentation by Dries the first time I ever saw him give a presentation in 2006. And some of these technologies, like, who cares about Vignette anymore? I mean, Georgia got off it, thank goodness. But like, really, they're not part of the conversation. But these other ones, a lot of them still are. And I think Expression Engine has come a long way in its day. But reach was this idea of getting out there and being in the hands of people. And richness was this idea of all the different things that you can build. And so we've got all this richness, but we don't have the reach. And that's really still where Drupal has its work to do. And that's where we have our work to do as a community, and that's where we have our work to do as a market if we want to get to where I think we can go. Because Drupal is important, I really believe that, but I also really believe that it's too hard and too expensive. Drupal's free because there's no licensing, but it's free with a capital F. People say it's free as in speech, not as in beer. And all open source is free like that because the hidden cost of open source technology is that you age while you use it. It takes your time. And your time, no matter who you are as a professional, is extremely valuable. You probably bill for it or at least get paid for it or something else. And if you start to count up all the time that's spent with people banging their heads against Drupal just to get it running, to get their use case done, you start to think about what the cost of all that time is. It's too expensive to run Drupal for it to be widely adopted as is. We've got work to do to make it easier so that it is not so expensive in terms of people's time and not so frustrating and blood pressure raising in order to get a lot more people to use it. And that's important. I think we see this world of like Legos as developers. I love this stuff. You can just plug it together. You can hook, you can module, theme, etc. And it's awesome. But when people come for their first time, they kind of see this, right? It's the big bucket of Legos that you get after all your kits are mixed together. And as a kid, I also love playing with this because like you can build whatever you want. You're like, I'm going to build the space castle pirate ship, which is kind of Drupal can build the space castle pirate ship of websites, which is amazing. But if this was what was in the aisle in the store, would your parents have ever bought it? If it was just like a bag of like mixed plastic? That's not how people consume stuff. That's not how they get introduced to something new. That you get introduced to Legos like this, right? There's a box. It's got a picture on it. You know that all the pieces you need to make this are inside the box. You know like what the age level is that it's appropriate for, and you're like, yeah, okay, I'll get that. Right? And then you get like 4 or 5 of those, and then you end up with the mixed bag, but you're happy with it at that point because you got started with something that was straightforward. You got started with something that was easy. And that was the experience that I had very early on with this Civic Space project. If you package it up and make it understandable and make it easy for people, they will use it. There's a huge audience out there in the universe for solutions. It's so much bigger than the audience for a toolkit because people don't want to like be told, okay, here's a saw, and here's a hammer, and here's some nails, go build yourself a house. They want a place to live, right? And that's kind of what we need to be able to give them on the web. And right now, Drupal is a little bit too much. You have to be a pioneer to make something out of it. When you first install Drupal, it's like, welcome to your website. Please define your content types. That's a very daunting task for someone. Like they just wanted a website to solve their problem. They didn't want to have to like think about the theory of their data model. That's really not where most people's brains go on day one. There's also this huge like infrastructure problem, and that's sort of like what I'm working on 24/7 because open source software doesn't actually do anything. It's just code. It's just lines of text in a file, and so your audience for a tarball is much smaller than your audience for a working website. So if we can solve the infrastructure problem and make it so that no one has to worry about these things ever again to use Drupal, Drupal will have like a much better a much wider adoption curve when you can get a website and not have to worry about keeping it online versus getting a tarball and thinking, okay, now where's my server, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, I feel like for Drupal to really reach its potential, like we need to do for Drupal what GitHub did for Git. In terms of taking an amazingly powerful technology, this is maybe only going to resonate with developers in the room, but like Git is awesome, but with GitHub it becomes easy and you just use it for everything. And we need something that'll do that for Drupal, that'll make it so easy and put it in the hands of people. And that's where we want to get to. That involves solving the infrastructure problem. That involves packaging it up so people can get it as a solution rather than as a toolkit. And that involves like having the ecosystem out there to really deliver that and figure out how to make it work for different market verticals, for governments, for organizations, for businesses, all these different types of folks. once it becomes easy to adopt Drupal, people will do it, and then they'll discover the power later. There's sort of like this layered complexity idea that we have to be able to deliver, where people aren't confronted with all the problems up front. They're confronted with like a solution that seems empowering, and then when they want to go a little bit further, they can sort of open the hood up and see that, oh, okay, I can do stuff in here, and that means I have to hire a developer, but I'm ready to do that now. I didn't have to do that on day one. That's going to be a very powerful experience. And I think this is important because, again, as I said, the history-making part of the web is just beginning. The revolutionary effects of technology occur when the technology fades away and it just becomes something that changes how people live and how they interact. And that's only just beginning to happen. We're actually still very early in the story. We're just getting started, and I would say it's important to remember the whole world is just getting started. I'm going to close with a short animated graph. This is some data that I got from the World Bank. Up is internet access. Right is GDP, basically how wealthy a country is. And it starts in 1990 and ends in 2010. It's like the 20-year span, not up to today, but up to relatively soon. And you can see nobody's really got the internet, but people are pretty wealthy. And so the internet's coming around, and we can see the progress that's going on. It was pretty good times. And then like around, there's going to be a little step back when the recession happened, right? But pay attention to that bottom right-hand or bottom left-hand cluster. That's most of the people in the world. Most of the people in the world are only just beginning to come online. And in the next 10 years, there will be 4 billion more people connected to the internet than there are now. Most of them will have things like this, or even the next generation of things like that. So they'll have a supercomputer that fits on their wrist, and they'll be connected to the internet. And we have no idea how much that's going to change things. And how much we can be a part of having that be a very meaningful change in how things work. It's almost impossible to overstate the scope of this opportunity. And you feel very grandiose, and it's easy to say, oh yeah, that guy, he's just like hand waving, he like talks loud and so forth. But this is a really big deal. This is something that has never been possible before. It's never been possible for people around the world to communicate on their own terms, to own their own data, to build their own websites, to have those experiences, and have them be widely accessible and free. It's always been going through several other layers of middlemen. It's always been, a radio broadcaster, a head of state, a league of nations. That was just like some rich dudes that got together and talked about other people's problems. Now we can actually work with each other. For the first time in the history of people, we can actually, around the world, talk to each other and work together. And I think, I said that before. I think that's the whole point here, is that this Renaissance effect that I talked about is totally unprecedented and so exciting and so amazing. And we have a very small part to play in that story, but I think it can be an important part. I think it really matters whether or not we actually can get this technology in the hands of a lot of people and let them do their thing. Because the internet, I think, creates light around people. And light, as a wise man said, light creates love, love creates trust, trust creates patience, patience creates understanding, understanding creates unity. And if we actually can have some unity on this planet, we can solve all of our problems. It ain't no thing. And that's Drupal's destiny, is really to deliver that type of possibility. And I thank you all for listening to me. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes and yes. Oh, you were on.
The very ending of the talk had the most obvious question. Where is this nice Drupal little plug and play?
Well, so I think there's a couple different answers, right? So Drupal 8 is going to have a lot of important new capabilities in it. It's going to be a lot of change as well, but I think it's going to open up a lot of possibilities. It's certainly going to help us answer this mobile use case problem, which is super important. It's going to codify a lot of what's been possible in Drupal for a while in terms of doing web services and being Drupal not just a website, but also an API or a source of data for other systems. And I think that also, I'm not here to toot my own horn, but like there's the stuff that I'm working on and other people are working on to basically deliver Drupal as a service, and the maturity of answers that can do that and do that at scale, at relatively low cost and in a frictionless way. That's also a big part of making it plug and play. And so, in the future, I would imagine in a year or two, if we're doing our job right, you should be able to go to some website somewhere and say, oh, I want to build a website that sells things. And I think that there's this thing called Commerce Kickstart that would be cool for doing that, and I'd like to use it, and you can click a button and do that. And you don't have to download anything, you don't have to set anything up, you can just start there. And then eventually, if you want to run your own thing, hopefully whoever did that didn't lock you into their platform. Like, you can still export everything, and you could go take your ball and move it over there if you need to. But your first experience would be interacting with a working system and getting a solution to your problem, not getting some code that you have to figure out how to set up and run. And that should be possible in the next year or two, without a doubt. Yeah? Yeah, how can the Drupal community kind of reach out and bring up, and connect with people? I think, I'm super excited by what we've started to see, and it's still early days for sure, but there's actually significant pickup of Drupal in developing countries. It's really a big deal in Brazil, right? And it's really a big deal in India. And I don't know if it's a big deal in China or not. China's kind of hard to get a handle on because you don't really know what's going on there, and I haven't been. But these places where there's a lot of people that are, suddenly able to get access. You're seeing it adopted, and what it takes is, people being able to go there, and it's sort of like this weird missionary thing of let me show you how to use this technology. But it's also something as simple as making sure that there's a translation of things into other languages, and being able to make it accessible, and doing putting a video online that explains it in someone else's terms. In the same way that I think you package Drupal as a product or as a solution for a nonprofit or for e-commerce, the even simpler thing that you have to do first is translate the installer into all these different languages, which thankfully we've done, so that people can have a chance of using it. People can understand it in their own language, in their own terms, and I think there's probably ultimately much bigger cultural things that have to happen, not just have it in someone else's language, but maybe present it to them in the way that's going to make sense, or that jives with the way that they see the world. And so it's really a matter of, I think, people in this community who have some understanding of other communities being able to essentially plant those seeds and make it accessible to it doesn't have to be accessible to everyone, even if it's just to a small group of people, because I feel like it kind of takes hold, and then hopefully someone else in Brazil or wherever else is okay, well, somebody showed me how to use Drupal once, and now I know how to use it, and I'm going to now I know my community, I know my world really well, I'm going to reformulate it in a way that makes sense to me, and that's then much more widely accessible. There is this kind of viral growth that happens, and it really comes from people trying to put it in the hands of folks who otherwise wouldn't get it. And so, some of that happens in person, some of that happens with improving the software and making it translated and turn it into products. Some of that happens just online with better videos and better documentation and stuff like that. Never underestimate the power of good documentation in spreading a technology. I didn't mention it in the slide, but that's another thing we could really work on in the Drupal community, is having clear how-to guides on just solving problems with Drupal, rather than, sometimes it's there's a million answers to every problem. Does that sort of get at what you're saying? Okay. Yeah.
So how do you see Drupal going from? I think Drupal still is very much viewed as a hackers community. It's very nerd based, and everybody's it's everybody's kind of clinging on to that still, and it's getting it to the next step of being accepted by this non-base. I mean, I think in this town things have changed greatly with government embracing Drupal. And,
yeah.
But how does that happen? How do you see that happening elsewhere? How do you make that easier elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think that all the things that I talked about are important, right? The ease of use and that sort of on-ramp question. Obviously, if people can't get their hands around something and use it, it's not going to be there. There's also, within the professional, especially on the professional side of it, we've got a lot of growing up to do still, right? There's businesses and companies that have been around for 5-10 years that are doing Drupal and doing a lot of Drupal, but it's still early days for the marketplace, and it's still early days in terms of being able to explain the power of this technology to organizations that are more risk averse and move a little bit more slowly. And I think that's a function of how well we can market ourselves. And that's not just marketing Drupal, that's also marketing whatever your company is. Because if you can't explain your company in a way that's going to be intelligible to the potential adopters of the technology, they're not going to believe in you and they're not going to buy it. And I think that that's something that's going to happen, and it is already happening. Like, we're seeing movement in this direction. You know, like as you said, in the government space, there's been a lot of people who have followed the lead of the White House, and now it's become a thing. And now you can just say, well, all these different people use it, and it's an easier sell. That's that's happening in other spaces too, in the media space, in the publishing space, in the sort of intranet space. You see a lot of people, like there's a success story, a couple of success stories with brands that people recognize, and then all of a sudden it's a safer call to say, okay, well, we'll use that. But that only happens, A, if we can get those success stories to happen in the first place, and B, if we have the good sense to promote them in a way that will be seen by the other people who would care about that sort of thing. So yes, you're absolutely right that there's this sort of maturity and evolution that's happening that's kind of, in some cases, it's also different people. Like the developers are going to keep developing, and then there's another community, and there's tension between these communities. Don't get me wrong, between the business community and the technology community. But I think one of the things we have going for us in Drupal is, even though there is tension between the business side and the technology side, it's not like we're opposed, right? Even though sometimes people have different, goals, and we speak different languages, and we dress a little bit differently, I think in a lot of cases, if you go down to like the third floor and like you go into the place where everybody's got like their booth set up, everybody's friends, everybody's working together in a lot of ways. We're all kind of rowing in the same direction, and even when you compete, you're friends. We have this wonderful like co-opetition that happens in this space, and I think that is we're really lucky to have that. In most other markets and most other technologies, people are like much more zero-sum, much more cutthroat, and they move more slowly as a group as a result because they're constantly stabbing each other in the back. And I think if we can hold on to that spirit of like, we're all sort of in this together, and this is a big opportunity, and we need to keep growing the pie overall, and not like, dragging each other down because I didn't get this deal or you didn't get that deal, we'll start to see more of that mature business ecosystem emerge, and that'll lead to wider adoption from large organizations and so forth. Yeah?
In the early days of the Drupal community, it seemed that there were a lot of like solo developers who started clustering in small shops and so forth. And then as Drupal started moving to the enterprise, you started having like these like massive armies of Drupal developers who tucked away people in industrial farms or whatever.
Sure.
And I remember a couple of years ago, there was conversations about how do we engage these developers and how they be part of the community. Just curious about your assessment about how that's worked so far, but what's the state of that today?
I think that you kind of have to let people be people, and I think that especially when someone does something because their boss told them to do it, they're not going to love it. And that's where we are with like the adoption of Drupal by large organizations. In some cases, it's like, I just work for this company, and I used to hack on C#, and now I hack on Drupal because that's what my manager told me to do, and I had to read a book to figure it out and whatever else. Like, that person may never be a part of the community, and that's okay, right? Because people, like, maybe his or her priority in life is like after work, he closes his laptop and goes home and like plays with his kids, and that's his number one thing, and that's totally cool, right? But I do think that we are having some success. Like you do meet people. I meet people at these types of events where it's like, they're relatively new to Drupal and they got into it because, they found it on some job. I talked with this guy on a he's not here, but I talked with him on a boat last night at this boat party, and he had was really looking for a job, and he took a job with the Romney campaign because it was doing web development and they were using Drupal, and then they were like, how committed are you? And he was more in it for the job than for Romney, and wasn't willing to move to Boston, so they let him go. But then he's like, oh yeah, I know Drupal, and I've got a friend who also does it, and let's do this together. And then they started a shop, and now they're doing really great. And I feel like there are many stories where people have their first introduction to Drupal through that type of cubicle-oriented experience, and because there is such an opportunity in this space to hang your own, shingle out and do your own thing, that the really interesting thing is people who break out of that and are like, I really want to be involved. I like this technology. I would like to do my own thing. I got introduced, or my first time was because of my work, but now I'm able to do whatever I want. Now I can start my own business. Now I can do my own shop. Now I can do my own campaign if I want. I think that's kind of more the story that you're seeing versus necessarily reaching people who view web development as their day job. And again, it's not wrong if web development is your day job, because that means that you have another thing that's very important in your life, and you're working to live, not living to work, and then that's totally a rational and correct decision. Does that make sense? Anything else? Yeah.
So, thinking about like WordPress having, 20% market share and sort of what's been successful in that, it
Yeah.
seems to me like a really low barrier of entry.
Yeah.
And especially like the ability to just like go into these like, websites that have like 500 themes and like find one that sort of like matches what you want.
Yeah.
And just kind of like go from there, and then slowly, once you sort of have it up, then slowly kind of reverse backwards and like learn the technology that you need. Then you start learning CSS.
Yeah.
And then you start learning a little bit of HTML, and you slowly work your way backwards.
Yeah.
And I feel like with Drupal, in order to get it to look the way you want it to, it still like it still sort of assumes that you have some sort of like proficiency in web languages. So you still have to be a certain level of a technologist in order to just kind of pull it off.
Yeah.
Or at least be like willing to just like throw yourself in and like just hack it up and work. So do you feel like there is opportunity in like competing with that kind of like WordPress model and like making things sort of like more polished and finished and letting people work back, or are we better off like just like pushing forward with how awesome the technology is and like just trying to bring more and more developers like into it?
Yes and yes, right? So it's like, should we have a more polished experience with Drupal and kind of like in the way that WordPress does? Like, you start out with something like, oh, I clicked and I got it and I picked this theme and now it looks like what I want, and then like that's sort of your like it's a gateway drug to becoming a web developer. You're like, okay, now it's CSS. I have to figure out how to make my links look the right color, and HTML. I'll figure out how to make this page look right. Like that's an experience that a lot of people have, and probably some people in this room have had an experience like that. Absolutely, that's something that we should see with Drupal. And part of the story of why WordPress has that huge market share is WordPress.com. WordPress.com has 10 million blogs. 10 million. It's like maybe probably up to 11 now. The last time I checked, it was 10 million. That's a lot of freaking websites. Now a lot of them are like, hello mom, I have a blog now, and like there's 2 posts on it and like a picture of a dog or whatever. But and so they're sort of juking the stats a little bit with that. But I think that's something that we should seek to be able to also have, and I think that comes from having in Drupalese, like WordPress has both like an easy to get, you go to WordPress.com, there's a clear use case, it's for personal publishing, and you can make it look kind of the way you'd like it to look very easily. And I feel that with Drupal, we are only beginning to get to the point where there's like a platforms where you can kind of a turnkey, just get it now type of experience. That's just beginning to happen. We're still kind of in maybe like 80% of the way there with installation profiles, providing like a clear use case of like, okay, I turned it on and now I got a solution rather than I got a box of tools. And from the theming perspective, yes, like it's really telling that the top themes, if you go to Drupal.org in terms of downloads and installs, there are all these themer toolkits. It's like Zen is the #1 theme. And if you go and install Zen and turn it on, it's like nothing. It doesn't actually make your website look good. It's a toolkit for making your website look good. It's for professionals who know how to build websites, which is really cool. We're never going to lose that. We have to keep that. That whole like professional ecosystem is core to how we have our value. But we definitely need to have more like just slap a theme on it and make it look like a website that I'd like to have. That's clearly something that's going to happen. And again, I think like we'll get that when there's a way that's rewarded and recognized. Like in my mind, there is this kind of magical confluence that can happen when if I make a good installation profile and it runs on a turnkey service, I could potentially make money from that, and that could be my job, is building great themes or building great installation profiles, not for one customer, but for the 1,000 customers that I never had to meet personally, that they just used my stuff, and then I get like a recurring revenue check every month. Like, I'd like to make that happen. That's one of the things I'm very interested in seeing occur, but that's going to take some time to do. But I think, again, setting up feedback loops where that sort of work is prioritized and rewarded within the ecosystem, not just with a claim, but also with like a paycheck, will really help drive that. In the same way that like being able to get paid for building apps for a phone makes for having like lots of good apps for your phone. Like if it was like all the apps in the App Store on your phone were open source, they probably wouldn't be that many and it probably wouldn't be that good, because it would just be people solving their own problems or solving a very specific problem for a customer. We're still a ways away from like making those general solutions widely available, but it that has to happen if we're going to get there. If it doesn't happen, we'll kind of have this weird plateau where it's only a power tool for professionals, and then we'll still be stuck at around 2 to 3% of the internet in perpetuity, which is still a lot, but it'd be kind of a shame. Yeah.
Does Drupal 8 move in the direction that talking about a move toward a WordPress environment?
Yeah. No. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say no. it makes it possible. There's some things that are possible within the context of Drupal 8 that are a little bit harder to do now, but Drupal 8 itself, it has more stuff built into it, like the idea that views is now a part of Drupal 8, and there's a more like mature system for doing layouts is now in Drupal 8, and it's not like you have to patch together all these different contrib modules. That's important. And the fact that there's like some mobile use cases thought about in the core, that's important. The fact that we have a templating system that's like much more like other templating systems and doesn't require as much knowledge of PHP, that's important. But I'm willing, I mean, who knows, because Drupal 8 isn't released, it's not baked. But my guess is that out of the box, Drupal 8 is still going to be this kind of like define your content types kind of experience. And it's going to take people building on top of Drupal 8, and again, making it a tailored solution for different market verticals, right? Like there needs to be Drupal 8. Drupal 8 is going to be an all things to all people core system. And then we need to be able to say, okay, well, here's Drupal for restaurants. Here's Drupal for beauty shops. Here's Drupal for hotels. Here's Drupal for community organizations. Here's Drupal for sports clubs. Like, and hopefully we'll have, like, with all those other things that I talked about, those core values, the professional ecosystem, the developer ecosystem can then take Drupal 8 sort of the last mile into these various different market verticals, and there will be platforms out there that enable people to get it as a website rather than as a tarball. So when the next genius iteration, like Open Atrium, sort of like comes out and like takes off, it won't be like, oh, I was really excited about this, except now I just have some code. They'll be able to say, I'm really excited about this, and I have a website, and I'm using it. But Drupal 8 itself is just one of those. It's a building block. It's not the answer. So we need to work and build on top of Drupal 8 to really see that happen. Yeah.
One of the big, when we're teaching someone Drupal for the first time, one of the first chasms we feel they have to leap across before they're not just a user, they're actually building something with it, is the language barrier. Like, for example, we don't have pages, we have nodes, which are bigger and better, and includes pages plus a whole lot more. Similar, we don't have tags, we have taxonomies and vocabularies, which encompass tags that are bigger and are so much more.
Right.
But there's always this step where someone has to leap to a broader conceptualization because it doesn't tie back to anything they personally experienced in the web, even if they built simple sites before.
Yep.
Do you think there's any movement towards that, or how would that even reconcile? You would never call a node a page because that's not what it is.
Right. A node is not a page. Sorry, it's an old inside joke. I think that's... so our abstractions are part of what make us powerful technology, but they're also part of what make us arcane, right? There's all these Drupalisms, and I think that some of what we're doing, and it's really a mixed bag. Sometimes we're doing this well, and sometimes we're not. As a technology community, is learning to embrace what other technology communities do, just even from like a naming and language and structure standpoint, and be more in line. Because Drupal got started, it was really pretty innovative. Like it really was. It was kind of out there when it first got rolling. And there's a lot of stuff that we have as a result of being very early. And it turns out we built it like this way, and the rest of the internet built it that way. And we can kind of want to like bring ourselves back into line with a lot of the other things. But I don't think that I don't think those abstractions are going to go away because they are very powerful and they're core to how we work. But I do hope that it becomes kind of like what Megan was talking about. Like you don't need to know those first, right? It's sort of like, again, that Drupal becomes more of a gateway drug to web development. And like you start out and you just notice maybe there's node in the URL, but that you don't care, right? Because you're editing your page. And only later when you start to think, oh wait, data model, and I want to, okay, and then I see a node is like the central unit of my data model. I got it. But that was driven by wanting to innovate on top of something that was already working, not like a barrier you had to climb over to get to have your first win. I think people need to have like much earlier and much more powerful wins with Drupal as a way of getting started for us to reach this sort of like global vision. Because right now it's just like you have to climb over too many hurdles to have your first feeling of success. Yes and yes. Right.
So what is the solution or ideas around that? Can Drupal.org get there, or does it make sense to that can focus for developers and so you have another place where there's that high level kind of this is what we're doing?
Totally. Yes, I also don't think that Drupal.org will solve any of our problems along these lines, and I don't expect it to. I don't think that's Drupal.org's job. I think that I wish that Drupal.org had slightly more
Pictures.
I was going to say that there was like a stronger editorial hand in like managing the whole all the documentation that's there, because there's just so much stuff and some of it's like outdated or unclear or other things. But it is what it is, and it's working, right? It's got us to where we are now, and I don't think you should say like, oh, Drupal.org sucks, or those people at Drupal.org, they don't know what they're doing. Like, they're working really hard and they're keeping this whole thing rolling, which is a pretty impressive feat. But I feel like the answer in that context is. Dries had a neat idea of making Drupal.com like this showcase, but I feel like that got put up and it hasn't changed in several years. That was a good idea, and it was a way of marketing Drupal, but I don't think that's even that important. I don't even think you need a Drupal.anything. I think it's up to us to make the use cases sort of clear, and like us to go out there and say like, well, I don't need on Drupal.org. We just need more people with their own blog posts about how they made something work, or better yet, a web. Like again, I'm gonna go back to my early experience. The way that we got thousands of nonprofit organizations to adopt Drupal was by building a website called Civic Space that talked about how Civic Space was the answer to your nonprofit website problem, and talking in their language to their use case, and then getting them to download something that was Drupal. And I feel like to really reach a wide audience, you can't talk about the technology. You have to talk about the solution. So there's a bunch of things that I like. I like that we, as we branch out, I like that we got a Stack Exchange site. Like, I thought that was a really good move on Drupal's part, because that's a way of like engaging with a wider community and using some other tools that are pretty cool for getting answers to questions. But that's still just developers helping each other. I think to reach the much wider audience, again, technology is going to fade into the background. The conversation isn't going to be about Drupal. It's going to be about the answer to your problem that you get, and oh, by the way, it's powered by Drupal. It's like I have an Android phone, right? And I say I have an Android phone because I'm a normal person. But if I wanted to be a pedantic nerd, I could say I have a Linux laptop that fits in my pocket, because Google took Linux and built some Java APIs on top of it and then made a mobile operating system. But nobody says that, because you have an Android phone and that solves your phone problem. And you don't care that it's Linux. And that doesn't mean that it's not important. That doesn't mean that like, good on all those people, but like, and this gets back to the whole question of the community. Like, I'm not a member of the Linux community. I use it every day. My whole career is built on top of it. I have submitted patch and bug and whatever 0 to that world, and that's okay, because I'm just a user, right? And we need more people that can get into Drupal just by having that experience of being a user, having a win, having something that solves our problem and works. And only later, when if they have a need to, do they get involved in the technology. Again, so like for us to win like this with Drupal, Drupal fades into the background and the solutions come to the foreground, I think. You had another question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
In the real world, nobody goes out and buys Windows. People go out and buy a machine to get on the internet.
Yes.
Or a machine to read their email or whatever. And maybe that's what, Drupal needs something like a solution, like you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think people don't want want a technology. They want a solution. And I think, again, Drupal as software has some maturing to do so that it has a better on ramp, so you get a quicker win. And I think that the real challenge with again, like the machine equivalent, like you don't buy a machine to run Drupal, but you want Drupal to be on the internet. Right, and people don't want to have to like figure out a server and a bunch of other stuff. Like that's what I'm doing with my whole like career, and that's what this is all about, right? And to solve that problem is kind of complicated and kind of hard, but kind of important, right? If we can make it turnkey to get this stuff, and you just get a website, right? I got a website. I didn't get Drupal. I got a website, and it solved my problems. And then later on, you're like, oh, I wanted to extend it, and then I found out that it has this wonderful system called Drupal that lets. Oh, and there's all these modules that other people have written that I can just pick up and use. That's sort of like the killer experience. That's like the gateway drug experience. And it's going to take work to get there, but I think we can, and I think it's going to matter. It's going to be important. But it's noon. You guys should get lunch. I'm happy to chat with you guys after. Thank you for your questions. Thanks for your attention. Really appreciate it.